Alrighty guys, so we went ahead and finished the first two parts of our new unit, our unit all about cells. We went ahead and covered a little bit of the chemistry of life, some of the properties of water, but now we're actually going to get into the nuts and bolts of what this unit is all about, which is cells. And so I had you all do this as a warm-up. Pretty much I wanted you to write down everything that you know about cells or what you think you know. Of course, you don't have to do that right now unless you want to challenge yourself. You can, of course, but let's go ahead and begin with what is cells and more importantly, what is a cell theory? So, the cell theory, if I were to take this pigeon that I have right here and I were to magnify this bird hundreds of times, eventually I would be able to pull out a cell out of my bird. And that's what we're going to talk about today. We're going to talk about the different types of cells that we have. So for one, remember that all living things are made out of cells. We learned this from our characteristics of life. And that also there are two generalized terms that we can use for cells. So the first being unicellular. And when I say unicellular, I simply mean that it's made of only one cell. Some very good examples of these would be like bacteria or most protists that we have out there. The next one would be multicellular. So multicellular cells, of course, are made out of many, many cells. And really good examples of those would be fungus, plants, animals, us, of course, we're part of the animal kingdom, but this is what we mean by multicellular organisms. So, the next part, cells are the basic unit of structure and function, and so I have a list of just some of the cells that we would find possibly within us. Being multicellular organisms, not all of our cells actually have the same structure or function, and it's very good that this is so, otherwise we would be all walking blobs, more or less, with really no defined features. So I gave some examples of the cells that we could find in our body, muscle cells being one. They help with our structure and movement. Bone cells, of course, also help with just the overall structure of our body. Skin cells to help from protection against maybe bacteria from invading our organs and things like that. Nerve cells so that we can sense our environment and perceive things, and of course fat cells. They help with warmth. They insulate our organs in order for us to generate enough heat to kind of keep an internal body temperature. It's very important that we have some fat in our body, otherwise we would die. So, and then of course, when we're talking about cells, we say that all cells come from pre-existing cells. And so I gave an example of reproduction. If I were to take an egg cell from my mom and a sperm cell from my dad, they would eventually come together. And them coming together would create a fertilized egg, or possibly what we call in essence a new cell. All right, and of course 9 months later, that cell will eventually continue to multiply and divide, and next thing you know, we have a baby. So, knowing these past three slides, we can say that the cell theory is, number one, all living things are composed of cells. Also, all cells are the basic units of life, structure, and function. And then finally, all new cells are produced from existing cells. So this is the tenets of our cell theory. How do you know if something is alive? Well, I have this cute little video. I loved it.
It's alive, and so is it, and it, and it.
So, well, I showed the video just to more or less show something that is technically alive. Okay, so I've showed the little cute video mostly because I wanted to remind you guys of what are the characteristics of life. And so I have put them down here. You should have them already in your foldables. But just in case you need a little refresher, the 7 characteristics of life and how we define life are as such. I'm not going to read you each one of them, but you can kind of look over your notes, see if they're the same of what I have up here. So I also, the couple of class periods before, talked about biotic versus abiotic things. And I showed you biotic versus abiotic because I wanted to try and, I wouldn't say fool you, but sort of. I wanted to fool you because I wanted you to see that viruses were actually not alive, although many people think that they are. We call them cellular parasites, and I give you this example of cells versus viruses, kind of a T-chart, and the reason being is because I want to show you the 3 different types of characteristics of life that viruses break, which is why they are not classified as alive. And the first one being that viruses cannot actually reproduce on their own. They have to use their host to reproduce, and since reproduction is a characteristic of life, we will say that they break this rule. Therefore, they are not alive. But if that's not good enough for you, the next rule they break is they do not actually metabolize. They cannot create any of the energy or metabolic actions they need for themselves. They use their host to do this. So again, we said that energy use and metabolism was a characteristic of life, and of course they break that one as well. And then finally, viruses are actually non-cellular. They are not made up of any cells, although they look very cellular, I guess you could say. However, they are not. They're mostly composed of different cell parts, like protein and things like that. They actually are not made of any cells. So since we said that cells are the basic unit of life, again, they break this characteristic. So this is why we would say that viruses are not alive or abiotic. So that gets me into the meat and potatoes of what I want to talk about today. And pretty much what we're going to cover is prokaryotic cells versus eukaryotic cells. And when I say this, there are very few, I guess, similarities you could say between a prokaryotic and a eukaryotic cell. The few that I have listed are actually in this picture. Both prokaryotic and eukaryotic cells have a plasma membrane. They do have cytoplasm, both of them, and most of them do have DNA. The big difference of where the DNA is stored, though, is what separates more or less my prokaryote from my eukaryote. See, the DNA is stored in the nucleus of my eukaryotic cell, but in my prokaryotic cell, the DNA is just more or less jumbled up into like a yarn-like region. It almost looks like a ball of yarn, but it's not actually in a nucleus. It's what we call the nucleoid region. It's just kind of like balled up DNA kind of floating in the cell. And then, of course, they also have ribosomes. The big ticket I want you to take away from this one is that there is a big size difference, too. I actually showed the scale up here. Prokaryotic cells are anywhere between 0.1 and 10 micrometers, while eukaryotic cells are anywhere between 10 to 100 micrometers, which is a significant difference. So the big ticket that I want you to take away when you're talking about prokaryotic cells and eukaryotic cells, the big difference between the two is prokaryotic cells don't have any nucleus. They also don't have any membrane-bound organelles. I don't actually have that written there, but that's also true. They do not have membrane-bound organelles, which would then, of course, say that our eukaryotes do have a nucleus and membrane-bound organelles. And so you can see that there in the picture. You can see all of the little organelles that we have in our eukaryotic picture, and you can see how our prokaryotic cell is more or less empty of these organelles. And our eukaryotic cells can be broken down further into animal cells and plant cells. And our prokaryotic cells, usually, like I said before, when we say prokaryote, we mean more or less like bacteria or protists. So, size comparison, again, I showed you the scale on the other page, but that's really what I wanted to show you the difference of. There's a big difference between the size of a prokaryotic cell, like a bacteria cell, versus the eukaryotic cell, like a human cell. And if you really want to kind of see the differences, I encourage you to visit the website that I have here, the link. It is very, very cool. It will more or less show you the size ratios of things by allowing you to zoom in on everyday things that we know in our life, and it gets really, really cool. So I encourage you to check out this link. If you can't get to it from this website, don't worry, because my Weebly will also have this link that you can play around with. And so that more or less is what I want you guys to understand, differences of prokaryote cells versus eukaryote cells.